The very last lesson I shared was judgment must begin at the house of God, and it would have been the Wednesday night after Christmas, which would have been December 31st, was the last lesson I had. Again, we didn't have a service on the first. Oh, what?
3 weeks, I think.
Yeah, December 31st wouldn't have been it because that was New Year's Eve. And, man, it was before the Christmas break, I think, the last lesson I had. And, but we didn't do it one time, the last Wednesday, the last day of December because of Christmas Eve. And then we had one time when just Art was here, we had, and so we just did music. We had another time that we canceled because of the weather, and then another time it was just the four of us. So this is the first service other than the just musical one. So it's been a long time since I talked about judgment must begin at the house of God. So we're going to do just a quick review there, otherwise we won't get past it. If any man suffer as a Christian, verse 16 said, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf. For the time is come, the judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first begin at us, what shall the end be of them that obey not the gospel of Christ? David Gusick made this comment about judgment beginning at the house of God. We must always remember that there is never any punishment from God for us in our sufferings, only glorification. For the Christians, the issue of punishment was settled once and for all at the cross, where Jesus endured all the punishment that Christians could ever face from God. So again, when we read that, judgment must begin at the house of God, it's not talking that God's got to punish us because we're not living up to something. Jesus paid for all of our sins. That was the punishment of our sins. So there were different ideas what it must mean. Judgment must first begin at the house of God. And one of the ideas that I thought made a lot of sense was the world judged the church and found it unworthy. And so the world persecuted the church. So judgment came to the church, but it was not the judgment from God. It was the judgment from the world. And we're getting back, I say, here in America, we're creeping ever closer to where the world of our government is getting less and less patient with the Church of God. And I don't mean the denomination Church of God. I mean Christians everywhere in America, the family of God. And so we're getting closer to that. But when judgment first began at the house of God, even before Peter wrote this, when it began in Jerusalem, that the church was being abused by the world, the persecution spread so many of the Jews, they ran from Jerusalem to get away from persecution, and consequently, they carried the gospel all over the then known world. And so churches were forming all over that if they'd have just sat down in Jerusalem and enjoyed the blessing of God without interruption, the rest of the world would have never got the gospel back then. So God used the punishment the world inflicted on the church to spread the gospel through other areas. He did that with the Jews fleeing from Jerusalem to get away from the persecution. Of course, he did it with Paul leaving Israel and preaching to the Gentiles. So now let's get into this week's lesson. 1 Peter, the last chapter, chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. That's what we're going to talk about. The elders which are among you, I exhort. The elders that are among you, the people watching over the churches. The elders which are among you I exhort. The word basically means I encourage, and there's something I want you to do. So an encouraging word from God, here's what you need to do. And he uses, here's why I can do that. Not only has God asked me to do it, but he said, who am also an elder. So he said, I'm one of you. You people that watch over the churches, he said, I'm one of you. I watch over churches. And he said, but more than that, I got something going for me you don't have going for you. And a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. So Peter said, like you, I'm a church elder. But I got a couple things going for me you don't. He said that I witnessed the sufferings of Christ. Not like John did. John went all the way to the cross. But Peter witnessed Jesus getting arrested in the garden. He followed behind as Jesus was taking to the judgment of the chief priest and the Pharisees. And so he'd seen him pushed around and beaten a little bit. He said, I've witnessed the sufferings of God. But then he says something very interesting. He said, also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. So, what is that exactly? I want to make sure I don't have this on the other side and get ahead of it. What is that exactly? What did Peter mean? I witnessed the glory that's coming. I partook of it. Peter, James, and John, often referred to as the Lord's inner three of the 12 disciples. He seemed to take those three. Two of them lived on to have a long ministry. James was beheaded. Stephen was the first recorded martyr, but James wasn't far behind him. But the Lord's inner three. Now, the guy who wrote the book of James is not the James that was obviously beheaded. He's the half-brother of Jesus that wrote the book of James. So he's another guy altogether. But Jesus said to the disciples, some of you are standing here who will not die till you see the Son of God coming in glory. What was he talking about? It seemed like the next day, if I remember right. He and the three disciples, Peter, John, and James, went up the mountain that we now refer to as the Mount of Transfiguration. And while up on the mountain, when Jesus was standing before him, all of a sudden he had Moses on one side and Elijah on the other. It was such a supernatural moment. I'm going to tell you something. Peter, James, and John never met Moses, and they never met Elijah. But they knew who they were. We find that out later with a remark that Peter makes. So supernaturally, they knew who those two guys were. And they seen, that story tells us, Jesus transfigured before them. They got a glimpse of what Jesus looks like in his glory. What we will see on the way up. They got a look of it that day. So they were the ones who would not die until they seen Jesus coming in his glory. They got to look at what you're going to see on the way up to heaven. So Peter said, I got some things here. And I always love that story because Peter's not shy. He's always the first guy to open his mouth. Jesus walked in the water. The others are stunned watching. Not Peter. He's saying, ooh, bid me come. She said, come on. Peter steps out of the boat and walks a little bit until a wave hits his leg, and then he looks down at the water, gets his eyes off Jesus, and begins to think. And in my mind, it doesn't say be. I know some others will not agree with me, but as I read that story, I think it's one of the great miracles in the Bible, because I defy anyone to step out of a boat in a lake and begin to sink. You step out of that boat and you're underwater. Almost instantly. So the wording of that I find fascinating. But Peter was that guy. And so when he said, "Ooh, Jesus, I got an idea. Let's build 3 tabernacles up here. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." And then the cloud turned real bright, and the brightness of the glory caused the 3 disciples to fall and close their eyes. And when the brightness lifted and they opened their eyes, this is such a profound thing. They saw no one but Jesus. Moses and Elijah weren't there anymore. But the message God was teaching them, this isn't about Moses and Elijah. This is about the Son of God. Don't get fixated at Moses and Elijah. Get fixated on the Son of God. So that's Peter. He's seen some things others didn't see. Again, John saw those things. James was now dead. He did a read version. Greetings from Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to God's chosen people who are away from their homes, people scattered over the areas of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. They went a long ways, and many of them carried the gospel with them. So he was writing to God's people, and up there in verse 1 of chapter 5, he's putting his attention now on the people watching over the flock. Pastors, in today's world we'd think pastors, elders, board members, teachers in the church. We'd think of that crowd. It could be anyone from what Daryl's doing over at his church to some woman sitting down with 4-year-olds teaching Bible stories to them. They're communicating the gospel in some way. Board members aren't necessarily communicating the gospel, but they're watching over the facilities and making sure those who are teaching are teaching. So he's talking to this group of people, and he refers to them as elders. First thing he tells them, feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. He said, I don't want anybody preaching for money. Now, he doesn't tell them they shouldn't get paid. Peter got paid. You say, how do you know that? Because Paul said, Paul worked. He built tents and stuff to support himself. He went some areas, and he would accept offerings. Other areas he wouldn't, as though God was saying, here, nope, you make tents and support yourself. And he said once, don't I have a right, in essence, to make money like Peter does, or to lead about a wife like Peter does? Paul was single. We don't know if he was always single. Some theologians argue that the group of Pharisees he was a part of before he got saved, you had to be married to be in that group. I have no way of knowing if that group of theologians is right or not. So if Paul had been married before salvation, one of two things happened, because he was single throughout the book of Acts. Either his wife died, or she rejected him when he got saved and divorced him. One of those two things happened. So as a Christian, he was a single man. And he said, don't I have a right to lead about a wife? Which would lead me to believe maybe his first wife died. But nonetheless, if indeed those theologians are correct, you had to be married. He was he sat at the feet of Gaius. He was a learning Pharisee. Maybe they had exceptions when you're learning. I don't know. But anyway, I thought I'd throw that out there. But he was saying, why am I working with my hands? Peter isn't. And he said, don't I have a right to get paid? There are times he did. The Philippians sent him money twice when he wasn't in Philippi. They had sent him money. They knew there were certain areas he went to he would not take offerings. And so they would help. They were not a rich church at all, but they loved his ministry and they would help support it. So Peter said, it's okay to get paid, but if that's your motive for doing it, then you shouldn't be a church elder. It shouldn't be. I mean, everybody's got to eat. How many of you know that's a good thing if you get some money to buy some food? And if you don't get paid there, you go out and you clean high school windows. No, I don't do any windows. Well, I do a few interior, not outside. A high school room. But you got to have money. It sure comes in handy at supper time. So he's not saying you should never get paid for anything. What he's saying, if you're a church elder, you're to feed the sheep. As you teach them, it should never be for profit. You can get paid, but it better never be your motivation for teaching. And so that's a lesson he's teaching. Flip your page over there if you would. Feed doesn't necessarily, I mean, the first thing we think about, feed them by preaching them the gospel, and that's certainly included. But the Greek word rendered feed is a better translation is the word tend the sheep. When you tend the sheep, it would include making sure they had something to eat. You took them to the right pastures and so forth. So the verb really denotes everything that's included in the office of a shepherd. Guiding, guarding, protecting, in other words, folding, no less than feeding. So that's what Vincent, a great scholar, says of that word. So what does Peter want them to do? Care for the flock. That's one. That same feed the flock. The New Living Translation, because of that word, what it really means, tend, says care for the flock of God entrusted to you. Watch over it willingly, not grudgingly, not for what you will get out of it, but because you are eager to serve God. All right, so the first job is to take care of the flock. That's if you're going to be in charge in some area of church, you need to be caring for the folk. That's what we got to do. He said, don't do it for filthy lucre. The word filthy is intended to convey the idea which lies in base or dishonorable. A lot of preachers wrap themselves around the doctrine of prosperity so they can say, God wants you to be wealthy. One way to get wealthy is to give to the church, and you need to give to good ground, someone doing the work of God the way it's supposed to be done. And then they'll say, we're good ground, give us. And they raise large offerings for themselves. Buy jets, private jets. And you know, if you can afford it, I mean, I'm not saying you can't have a private jet. But some of those prosperity preachers not long ago took special offerings to buy a new private jet from the one they had because it was faster. And their argument was, we can get where we're going quicker and work for God faster. And that would be like a guy buying a Cadillac, a brand new Cadillac this year, and next year thinking, well, I think it would give God more honor if I bought me Rolls Royce and got me a driver. You know, it's just we don't see that in any of the apostles in the New Testament. We don't see them milking the people to make you richer, you being those caring for the sheep. So we got to really walk a fine line. We understand preachers need to eat like everybody else, but they need to be able to, in today's world, have a car, buy fuel for that car, and all the things involved with daily living, rent, buy a house, whatever it is. But at the same time, Peter said, never do it for money. That's filthy. That's spiritually filthy if that's your motivation. All right, now, willingness in the Greek means to be prompted by a love for those you watch over. We must be in the ministry for the good of those we minister to, rather for how it will benefit us. What does a ready mind mean? He said you have to have a ready mind. That means willingly, with alacrity. Now, I looked that word up. I didn't know what that word was. I read that in the Greek dictionary, Sayer's Greek dictionary. Do you know what alacrity is? I had to look it up. It means a brisk and cheerful readiness. Who's teaching who? Grammar right now. Alacrity. So the Bible's telling us, Thayer, the Greek scholar, is telling us that the word willingly means that you ought to be serving the people with alacrity, which is a brisk and cheerful readiness, according to the Oxford Dictionary. A ready mind, denoting not mere willingness, but zeal, Vincent said. So, means that we elders of the church must be zealous and cheerfully so, to be to see the congregation grow in their relationship with God. So if you have, we had 300 on a Sunday morning on average. The last year we were at full gospel. It's easy to stand up and preach to 300, but that 300 was no more important than the handful we have here on a Sunday morning. They deserve the same due diligence. If you're going to stand up and preach, it doesn't matter how many are there, you need to give it the same diligence. Now, can you imagine if we had 40 people? One way churches grow is what's called attrition. There's some difficulty going on in different churches all the time. And so sometimes a group will leave a church, and they'll go try other churches. If we had a group that had just left a church in Omaha or Council Bluffs, about 40 of them, when they walked in here next Sunday morning to try us out, and they decided to try us 3 or 4 weeks, boy, we'd all be encouraged, wouldn't we?
Oh, wow.
And we'd think, this is great. And after 3 or 4 weeks, they decided, no, this isn't the one, and got up and left, and we're back to the fewer crowd, the lesser crowd the next Sunday. I should be able to preach just enthusiastically to you folk when they left. I'd be all fired up, obviously. All of a sudden there's folk out there. I'd be fired up. But I should have the same passion if I have anyone listening to me. I should be able to share the word with the same passion. All right, now, verse 3. Here's another thing he tells the people who are looking out for the church. He doesn't want you to do it for filthy lucre. Filthy lucre? Lucre. There we go. L-U-C-R-E. Money. He doesn't want you doing it. Everybody gets dirty sometimes. You can be filthy. How many ever get filthy?
Yeah.
Once in a while. I try not to, but hey. If something's a real dirty job, I try to get Barb to do it.
How many work in the
That's a joke, on. What are you nodding for? All right. So it said, he goes on, neither as being lords over God's heritage. Who's God's heritage? The church. But being examples, or we would use the word examples, to the flock. The easy to read version is, don't be like a ruler over those you are responsible for, but be good examples to them. Don't be a ruler, be an example. Now, listen to what Jesus said in Matthew 20, 25 to 28. But Jesus called them unto him and said, you know that the princes of the Gentiles, the non-Jews, exercise dominion over them. Those with authority, in other words, exercise dominion over those they have authority over. And they that are great exercise authority upon them. Look at what he said in verse 26, Jesus talking. But it shall not be so among you. Here's the principle for church leadership. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. That word minister means servant. And whosoever will be chief among you, now we use the word more directly, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of God came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. So, the husband, I use that verse for a lot of things, that passage. when I taught the message one Sunday morning, honey, can I get you anything?
Yeah, I've heard that one.
When I taught that message, it was from this principle. Men think I'm the head of the house. The woman can wait on me. Christian men, many of them have that opinion. They're taught from the time they're growing up in a church. Men are the head of the house. Yes, they are. That means they've got a sterner answer they must give to God about how the house runs. It's their responsibility. But Jesus said, let me tell you about authority. Here's how it works. If you have authority over someone, serve them. Use that authority to be a blessing to them. Use that authority to encourage them. And then he gave the supreme example himself. He said, I'm God. I'm the Son of Man. Now I want to show you something. Paul writes, the head of the woman is the man. Right? The head of the man is Christ. The head of Christ is God. So yeah, men want to strut. I'm the head of the woman, the Bible says so. Absolutely true. I'll never argue with the Scripture. But what did Jesus, the head of man, say? He said, I didn't come here for you men to serve me. I come to serve you. So Peter said, don't lord it over them. Be an example to them. So when I taught that message on a Sunday morning, I said, I don't sit on the couch with my recliner out and say, honey, go get me some ice cream. I lower the footpiece, whatever that's called. I lower it, get out, go get me some ice cream, and when I'm in there, I say, honey, can I get you anything? I'm already in there. Makes sense, right? Honey, can I get you anything? And that was the title of the message. God has called me to be the head over the woman. So what do I do with that headship? You see it everywhere in the Scripture. Jesus said, I'm your head, but I serve you. I didn't come here to get served by you. So how did Jesus, the head of man, act? He was an example to his disciples. So what does Peter, one of those disciples, tell the leaders of the church? You have authority over the congregation. Here's how you use that authority. You don't lord it over them. You be an example to them. None of us like to have fingers in our face. We can get that at work sometimes. And told what to do. Nobody likes that. We don't teach this enough. There are churches that teach men you're in charge, and those men lord it over the women. Absolutely the very thing that Jesus said, if you want to be great, be the servant. Who's the great man? It's the man who understands he has authority over the woman, and he uses that authority to serve her for her good. Doesn't mean I wash your feet, take your toenail polish off. And I do that. Don't wash your feet, but I do the other. But it means, as a couple, we want to bless each other. And as a church pastor, you want the people leaving blessed. Not thinking, can you imagine we got a small group of, I'd start saying, you do this, you do that. Before long, that small group would be my family. And then my family would sit me down saying, we ain't hanging around, you keep that up. So they'd straighten me out. The point is, that's what Peter's talking about. The example Jesus gave us, true leadership is being willing to serve. Did Jesus feel he was condescending beneath the disciples by serving them? Not at all. He served them in everything he did. When they followed him, he made sure they had food. He taught them more. Can you imagine going to the Bible school of Jesus Christ? learning at his feet for 3 years? Wow. That would be an amazing thing. So, verse 4 in closing. He said, you lords, here's what you do. You feed the sheep. You don't lord it over God's people, but you're an example to them. And then verse 4, and when the chief shepherd shall appear, you shall receive a crown of glory that fades not away. What we get there never goes away. Whoever wins the Super Bowl Sunday, San Francisco or Kansas City, I picked San Francisco by 15. But whoever wins that Super Bowl, that's good news for you because I always pick wrong at the Super Bowl. But whoever wins that Super Bowl, they're champions until the next Super Bowl's over. A year from now, someone else. That's what Paul teaches. You do all this to win a crown that fadeth away. Next year, someone replaces you as champion. He said, you ought to do it for a crown that never passes away. When you do it God's way, the sheep shepherd's going to come along, and you're going to receive a glorious crown which never loses its brightness. All right, and down there, I gave the example I've already alluded to, 1 Corinthians 11:3. I'd have you know that the head of every man is Christ. The head of the woman is the man. The head of Christ is God. And yet Jesus didn't lord it over his disciples. Instead, he was an example and a teacher to them.